Welcome back, and today we're looking at the 9th and 10th ditches of the 8th circle, which include the schismatics and the...
Yes, it's Inferno, yes it is. Oh, it's Inferno for you.
Here we are, descending to the end of the 8th circle, and there are 2 more ditches to go, the schismatics and the falsifiers. The 9th ditch of Circle 8 is in Canto 28. Dante begins, "Even in words not bounded by rhyme's law, through many repetitions of the tale, how could the blood and wounds that I now saw be fully told? Every tongue would surely fail, because our powers of speech and memory are not meant to comprehend on such a scale." Now, in the last ditch, 8.8, the evil counselors, Dante finally learned his lesson. Pride in your voice and pride in your poetry is dangerous. Remember how in the last episode, Dante finally discovered that he needed to curb his poetry, to hold himself back, and not go beyond the bounds that had been laid for him. He needed to make sure he used his gift of poetry appropriately. Well, here he's showing the example of that. Instead of bragging about his poetry, like he was doing back with the snakes, he's saying, you know, language can't really accomplish this. Our powers of speech and memory are not meant to comprehend on such a scale. He says that language and poetry can't describe what he saw down in this ditch. He's reaching the very middle of hell, and it's too great, it's too overwhelming. And instead of bragging about his poetry, he admits his inability to express what he's trying to express. The idea that language can't express an idea is called ineffability. When something is ineffable, there are no words to describe it. It is beyond the powers of language. And from here on, throughout the Inferno, Dante's going to return to this idea of ineffability over and over again. Because Dante is finally curbing back his poetry and saying, it's true, language can't accomplish everything. As he looks down into the 9th ditch, he describes all of this carnage and all of these horrible wounds that he sees, worse than all the battles he knows of put together. And instead of trying to pretty up his language and make it eloquent, he speaks bluntly and almost crudely as he describes the horror of what he sees. These souls are being hacked in pieces and chopped in half and having their heads severed off and their arms and their legs. This is the contrapasso of the schismatics. In life, they caused division in groups. They instigated conflict between groups of people. And therefore, in hell, they are divided themselves. Just like they broke up the band, just like they split up the team, here in hell they are being physically broken up and split up. And although that sounds something like an inverted contrapasso, after all, they did the dividing and now here they are divided, in reality we see that they are contributing to their division just as much as the demon with the big axe who's chopping them up. The first sinner that Dante sees is Muhammad. And when Muhammad sees Dante, he grabs himself and pulls himself open. He's been split all the way down. He opens himself up, showing how the souls are really continuing to divide themselves. And it's interesting that Dante puts Muhammad down here among the divisive. He envisioned Muhammad as a figure who had split off from Christianity and caused this huge division between 2 great world religions. And if you think back about the Middle Ages, there was all kinds of violence and bloodshed going on back and forth between these 2 groups. Dante's thinking of the repercussions, how huge and political the repercussions of this action were. And so in Dante's mind, Muhammad is greatly guilty of years and years and decades and centuries of violence. We hear the explanation of what happens to the souls in the pit. And since all of these other sinners that you see sowed scandal and schism in their lives, now they are ripped apart in reciprocity. Back there a devil waits to hack and flay each one of us with his sharp edge of his blade, cleaving anew each time we pass his way, every member of this miserable parade. For by the time we have circled the whole pit, we are healed of the cuts he has already made. So these sinners are divided, and then as they circle around the circle, they heal up and they get chopped again by the time they get up to the top. Dante and Virgil chat with Muhammad for a little while and a few other souls before they come in contact with a particularly important soul named Bertrand Aborn. Dante describes Bertrand. Truly I saw, as I can see today, a headless body with the others there, trudging like them along the dismal way. It held its severed head up by the hair, swinging it like a lantern in the night as it cried, "Oh me," and caught us with its stare. Out of itself it had made for itself a light. They were 2 in 1 and 1 in 2. How this could be is known to him who in his might ordains it. So Bertrand Aborn has his head chopped off, and he holds it and carries it around like a lantern, and Dante is awed by the fact that he is both 2 parts while still being 1. Bertrand holds his head out towards them and speaks to them, saying, "Behold my miserable fate, live man among the dead, in your journeying try to find another punishment so great. "No, I am Bertrand Aborn, so you may bring news of me back with you. I am the one who counseled wickedness to the young king. Because of me, the father fought the son. Ahithophel did no worse when he instigated wickedly with King David and Absalom. Two who were one by me were separated. I carry my brain separated from its source inside this trunk. In me is demonstrated how the law of retribution takes its course." So Bertrand Aborn is in hell for instigating a rebellion. Prince Henry rebelled against Henry II, and Bertrand helped to advise Prince Henry. And so by causing this split between a father and a son, and even more importantly, between a king and a prince, Bertrand was severing the head of state from his line, and therefore his own head is cut off. Ahithophel, by the way, is a famous counselor who counseled the evil son of King David to fight against his father. It's a similar circumstance to what Bertrand Aborn did. The most interesting thing about Bertrand Aborn, though, is the fact that he's the only character in the entire book who uses the term contrapasso, the law of retribution. Contrapasso is obviously essential to our understanding of the Inferno, and yet Dante waits till almost the end to give it a name, to term it. It's interesting that Dante would wait this long before he actually tells us what he's been doing all along. He does something similar in Canto 11. He waits until a third of the way through the book before he actually tells us anything about the structure of hell, and says, "Oh yeah, see all those things we did up there? This is how they're organized. This is the whole system of hell." He allows the reader to sort of draw his or her own impressions before actually telling us what he wants us to see. This is different from some other books I read in my class, like Scarlet Letter and Faust, both of which open with an explanation to the reader saying, "Hey, this is how to read my book." Chapter 1 of Scarlet Letter, for instance, is nothing more than a bunch of symbolism, a door and a rose. And the narrator at the end of chapter 1 picks the rose and hands it to the reader saying, "Here, reader, take this. Let it symbolize the way I want you to read this story, which is to look for the good, the hope in a dark story." The play Faust also opens with this prologue in heaven, and at the end of the prologue, the Lord turns to his angels and says, "Hey, you all are the audience of this story, and as you're watching this story, make sure you're paying attention to the love and the hope that come out of a tale of darkness." So, both of them explain how they want you to read the story from the very beginning. Dante, on the other hand, waits until you've gotten almost all the way through his book before saying, "Hey, did you see what I was doing? This is contrapasso." It's also interesting that Bertrand Aborn is the one chosen to introduce the term. Bertrand Aborn was a famous poet, and a poet that Dante really respected. In fact, Dante once said that Bertrand Aborn was the only good war poet. And here in this scene of carnage and war, Dante uses this war poet, who he highly respects, to introduce the idea of contrapasso. Remember, contrapasso is poetic justice. It's justice that's symbolic. And both symbolism and poetic justice seem like appropriate ideas for a poet to introduce. There's one final reason why Dante may have waited till now to introduce the term of contrapasso, and it's because he has something important he wants to express to us about retribution. The idea of getting what you deserve, and punishment that fits what you deserve. Canto 29 opens with this idea of retribution again. Dante continues to stare at the mutilation and the horror down there until finally Virgil gets a little annoyed and tells him, "Come on, we need to move, we can't stay here all day." After all, if he wants to see every single soul in the circle, he's gonna have to wait through 22 miles of them. Dante is apologetic, but says, "Actually, I was looking for someone specific down there. I thought I saw my relative, my kinsman." Dante says in line 22, "Your attention should not lie in that direction. Let him stay there and switch your thoughts to other things as we pass by. He was pointing at you as he stood beneath the bridge, thrusting his finger threateningly, the one called Jerry Dalbello by others in the ditch. At that moment you were all intent upon the soul once held hot for. When you came to look where he'd been standing, he was gone." "My leader," I said, "his violent death, whose claim for vengeance is not yet satisfied by those who have been implicated in the shame, made him indignant. I think that is why he chose to go away without any word to me, and that is why my pity for him goes." Jerry Dalbello was Dante's father's cousin, and he's down here among the divisive because he was involved in a feud going back and forth, and was murdered as part of that. It was common in Italy during this time that if someone murdered your family member, you should go and, in retribution, murder that person. The only problem with that is that that family suddenly turns around and murders you, and then your family turns around and murders one of them, and back and forth until it becomes a horrible vendetta. We can see a similar circumstance going on in Romeo and Juliet, between the Capulets and the Montagues. They keep killing each other. And the more they kill each other, the worse things get. The more it escalates, causing division and schism, just like Dante's talking about here. So when Jerry Dalbello, who is Dante's relative, sees Dante, he points an accusing finger and then moves on without speaking to Dante. The reason he does this is that Dante has not avenged his murder. Dante has not carried out retribution for him. And so Dante draws a distinction between human retribution and divine retribution. In hell, we're following the law of contrapasso. You get what you deserve. Symbolic justice from heaven. But in Italy, the place was full of human justice, human retribution. You killed one of mine, I'm going to kill one of yours. The only result of this is further and further violence, more and more division, and condemnation to hell. So Dante, instead of saying, I'll go out and avenge your murder, Jerry, don't worry, he says, well, I pity him. Oh well. And he goes on. So perhaps that's why Dante waits till now to talk about contrapasso, so he can compare divine contrapasso with human retribution. But we move into the 10th and final ditch of the 8th circle. Dante, similar to the way he did with the schismatics, describes this in terms of its vastness. Just like in the last ditch, where if you took all the carnage from all these battles and put them in one ditch, it wouldn't compare to the horror of what he saw. He says if you took all of these great hospitals and all of these great sick beds and took all the sick people and dumped them in a ditch, it wouldn't compare to what I just saw. This pit is filled with diseased people representing the contrapasso of the falsifiers. Falsifiers are people who took something and corrupted it and changed it into something else. And just as they corrupted that object, they are corrupted with disease. Their skin is corrupted with leprosy. Their minds are corrupted with insanity. There are 4 types of falsification addressed here. The first is alchemy. The alchemist attempted to take base metals and transform them into gold. 2 souls here represent the alchemist. They are Griffolino and Capocchio. The contrapasso of the alchemist is to be covered with leprosy. Their scabs are horrifying and completely covering them so thickly that Virgil calls it like chainmail. I saw these sinners rake their own flesh because nothing else avails against the burning itch. The scabs would flake when they were dragged by the sinner's fingernails, the way a knife will scrape a carp or do the same to a fish with even larger scales. Nasty. Both of these sinners were burned at the stake for heresy, and they tell their story. And as Canto 30 opens, suddenly, a couple of crazy people run up, the insane man grabs Capocchio by the neck and drags him off chewing on him. The falsifiers who are cursed with insanity are the identity thefts, the personifiers. They pretend to be someone else in life, and therefore they've lost their own identity in hell. Griffolino, who hasn't been dragged off and chewed up, tells who they are. They're Gianni and Mira. Gianni was hired to impersonate a dead man for his son so that he could write up the will, but instead of writing the will to give the son all the money, he wrote it for himself. And Mira was cursed with madness to fall in love with her father, and so she impersonated her mother to sleep with him. Dante moves on to find more sinners who are swollen and bloated from dropsy. They can't move and they lie on their backs. These are the counterfeiters who changed money. They speak to Master Adam, who's a counterfeiter, and he tells them his story, and then he points out the feverish people behind him. These are the false witnesses who corrupted their testimony. They are Potiphar's wife, who lied and said Joseph tried to rape her, when really it was the other way around, and Sinon, who was the Greek who was left over on the beach with the Trojan horse, to convince the Trojans that the Trojan horse was actually an offering to the gods and the Greeks had headed on out of there. Sinon's name is kind of a play on words in Italian because it means both yes and no. Si and no. As if he's talking out of both sides of his mouth, this double talk and this duplicitousness that illustrates false witness. Because Sinon convinced the Trojans that the horse was safe, it led to the destruction of Troy. But then we get this interesting argument between Sinon and Master Adam. After Master Adam points out Sinon and tells who he is, Sinon gets mad and punches Master Adam in the stomach. And perhaps annoyed at being talked about with such dark insinuation, one of them punched him right where his solid paunch puffed out. It sounded like the beating of a drum. Then Master Adam smacked him hard in the face with an arm that was just as hard and said to him, "My limb may keep me fastened to this place because they are so heavy, but at my side I have a free arm fit for such a case." "When you were burned," the other replied, "there wasn't very much that arm could do, but it worked just fine with the coins you falsified." "What you're saying now is true, but you didn't give such truthful testimony the day the Trojan leaders questioned you." "My words were false, you falsified money. One sin brought me here, yours were a multitude. What demon did so many? Recall the horse, you perjurer. May it stretch you on the rack to realize the whole world knows you are a lying cur. May you be racked by thirst that cracks and dries your tongue, and the rancid fin that makes your gut hedge before your eyes. Your sickness spreads your big mouth, which has been your bane before. I am sick with thirst, and humors make me swell, but then your aches and your limbs burn. You'd be quick to give, without much need for an invitation, the mirror of Narcissus a good lick. So basically just a gossipy insult battle with about as much intellectual content as a comments section on the internet. Dante's eagerly listening in until Virgil gets very angry. I was following this with all my concentration when my master told me, "Watch some more, I say, and then you'll answer to my indignation." When I heard him speak to me that way in anger, I turned to face him hurriedly with a shame that shakes me to this very day. As one who dreams he is in jeopardy, and dreaming, wishes it were a dream, and thus wants what is real as if it were fantasy, so I became all speechless there, because I wanted to seek pardon, and I did seek pardon, without knowing that I was. So Dante feels terrible that he's been listening in on this conversation, and he turns to Virgil without knowing what to say, and Virgil forgives him. Notice that Dante's crime here is listening to the falsifiers, listening to those false witnesses who are talking about things that are really not good for him. He's supposed to be gaining knowledge that will help him get to heaven, and ultimately, listening to this empty gossip and these empty insults is just dragging him down. But notice the contrast in the way that he asks for forgiveness, where the language and the argument of the falsifiers is hollow and useless. Dante's own apology comes not from language, but from sincerity. He truly is sorry deep down inside, but he doesn't know how to express it. And he expresses it through his face, through his own sincerity, instead of through his eloquent language. In other words, it's more important to be sincere than to be eloquent. And these falsifiers who so eloquently tricked people into believing them, well, they really weren't sincere at all. And they're in hell. Virgil excuses him, saying, "It's okay. And I'll always be here to help you back if you go astray again." This might again be a reference to the significance of poetry and how poetry guides us towards what's good, even though empty, hollow gossip guides us away. Canto 31 opens with Dante saying, "I had been pricked by one and the same tongue, making my 2 cheeks tingle and turn red, which then supplied the balm where it had stung." Virgil both chastises Dante to get him away from the gossip and eases his pain by forgiving him, showing again how poetry can correct and comfort. And now we come to the end of the 8th circle, and the 9th circle is down in a pit in the very center of the Inferno. This physical divide further demonstrates the distance between the very deepest souls in hell, how very cold and dark they are. And as they approach the edge, Dante sees something that he doesn't understand. It looks like a city, and he hears a horn blowing. These are the giants. The giants are chained in a ring around the edge of the pit. And if you recall your mythology, these are the titans who fought against the gods. They show pride and defiance against heaven. The first giant they run into is not actually a titan, it's Nimrod. Nimrod is associated with building the Tower of Babel, and Dante depicts him as larger than life. In fact, he's gigantic, showing how these heroes of old were huge, not only in their story, but also in their stature. But when they see Nimrod, Nimrod begins to shout and babble this horrible sound. Tore from his raw throat, and that fierce cry seemed to be the sweetest psalm his mouth was fitted for. His language is corrupted, and he represents something about the corruption of language. Dante's been talking throughout this whole section about how language fails, language is flawed. Ineffability. Nimrod built the Tower of Babel, trying to get all the way to heaven so that he could rise up to the level of God. Defiance against God again. But God stopped these builders of this tower by confusing their language so that none of them could speak to each other, they couldn't work together, and they had to scatter. Therefore, the one perfect language which came from the Garden of Eden is destroyed and decimated by human pride and human defiance. Dante's going to continue that idea in the next canto, so be listening for it. A similar idea about language is going to be reintroduced when we reach the end of the Divine Comedy in heaven. Dante's going to run into Adam and talk about language in Eden. For now, language is corrupted and warped and fallen like everything else. But ultimately, there was a perfect language once in Eden. They move on and see some of the titans who are bound down here. And they come across Antaeus, who's not exactly one of the titans, although he is related. Because Antaeus didn't fight against Jove, he is not bound. And Virgil commands him, and Antaeus takes them and lowers them into the pit, into the final circle of hell, Cocytus, circle 9. Tune in next time for Dante's tragic voice, and the most horrifying part of hell of all, and Satan!
Yes, it's Inferno, yes it is. Oh, it's Inferno, Inferno for you.